Well, good morning. It's my pleasure to be here, and I have to say that I'm pleasantly surprised with the turnout. As somebody who's spent her whole career in the nonprofit sector, I didn't know that there was such appeal for wanting to know more about the nonprofit sector, but it's been my life and it's really, truly my passion. So I don't look at today as a presentation. I look at it as an opportunity for me to share my experiences, some of the lessons learned. We really will go into detail about what it takes to sustain a nonprofit organization. But the things that I really hope that you'll walk away with is kind of understanding how a nonprofit organization evolves, kind of the ups and downs and the cycles of its life. Understanding the various sources of potential revenue that it takes to keep a nonprofit going. And along with that, understanding the capacities and the talents that it requires. I've often said, and one of my first jobs out of college was with a for-profit. It was a ABC affiliate. But one of the things I've said over time is I feel like nonprofits are expected to provide a superior product or service, and I think they should be, but they're often required to do so with less in terms of money and people. And I think that sometimes takes more talent, not less. So I feel the nonprofit sector really has earned its stripes, if you will, for the respect I think it should garner. And within that, we'll talk a little bit about, more and more, I'm really focused on creating a culture that's focused on mission, relationships, and impact. So I'll use the term culture philanthropy, but we'll talk more about that later. And again, the capacities and the quality and impact of services. But I want to encourage you, even though we only have an hour and a half, I want to encourage questions throughout. And I'd like to just get a sense, even though there are a lot of us, I'm going to ask each of you in 15 seconds or less just to give us your name and tell us what brought you here.
With the juvenile court, we advocate for abuse and neglect of kids.
Okay, thank you. And anybody else that we might have missed that came in later? Okay, in the back.
Executive Director of the Active Alliance Center, provide services, program resources, and classes to the blind and visual challenges of Southern and Counties.
Okay, thank you. I think you can hear just from everybody's introductions the diversity of the nonprofit sector, and that's one of the things I love. My own background, I spent many years in public television in both development and marketing, and did some dabbling in programming. Then became an associate director of a YWCA. From there, I went to Grand Rapids, where I started up a nonprofit management support organization. So it was like a collaboration with United Way, universities, and others that provided consulting and technical assistance services to nonprofits. And then about 20 years ago, I was recruited to Summit County to start up Summit Education Initiative, which works on a variety of school community partnerships and improvement initiatives in Summit County. 15 years ago, I started up my own, or 14 years ago, my own nonprofit consulting business. So I've had the pleasure of working with scores of nonprofits, doing anything from organizational assessments to helping with strategic planning, but with a very heavy focus on fund development. I think when I started up my business, the economy was starting to go south, and the requests that that were coming in were a lot for help with fund development. So I have facilitated, coordinated with large leadership teams a number of major fundraising campaigns in the community. And again, I want to kind of give you a very solid overview of the different components of sustainable funding base, but I'm going to be interspersing it with stories, real life stories from some of the organizations that I've worked with as a volunteer and or as a client. And I want to encourage you again, if you have a burning question, please feel free to ask it as we go along. Obviously, sustainability is important. I mean, you could say it's a no-brainer. If we're not sustaining the organization, it's not delivering a mission. But there are actually, hopefully the most burning reason for that is that you want to see the services and programs fulfilled that your nonprofit offers. But there are actually some legal reasons as well. Somebody indicated they just submitted their application for nonprofit tax-exempt status. And to have your nonprofit 501c3 tax-exempt status, you have to be able to meet some fundraising or some funding thresholds that the IRS has. And one of them is that 1/3 of your charity's income must come from the general public or a governmental source. And so they're giving you nonprofit status, so they want to make certain that you're actually serving the public. And one of the measures of assessing that is the sources of your funding base. There are sometimes government and funder policies change, and we can see that happening right now. I know my daughter is in environmental education, and the environment is not a high national priority right now, so you're seeing funding cuts come down the pike. So the more you can build into your organization some sustainable funding sources, the better you're going to be able to weather those ups and downs with policy changes. And I know, again, when I came to Summit County to start up Summit Education Initiative, the funding community had raised monies to establish an endowment, and that endowment grew while I was there to the point where about 40% of our operating budget was coming from our endowment income. And we'll talk more about endowments later, but the founders of Summit Education Initiative understood that education policies also change over time with different policy leaders, and so they wanted to make certain that the organization would be able to stay focused on its mission through those ups and downs. Family wealth is transferred, and that can sometimes dramatically change the types of nonprofits that are available at a local level. It can also change the funding that comes into play. Organizations experience crises. There's one organization that I'm working with right now. It's called Countryside Conservancy, and they manage the farms that are in the national park and the farmers markets. And about a year and a half ago, they lost their visionary founder, Darwin Kelsey. And it was a very traumatic experience for the organization. And what I can say is they have rebounded. They're continuing the vision of the founder, but they're also going in new directions. But you know, the more solid your funding base is, trust me, the easier it is to weather those kinds of crises. I already talked about economic downturns. And then the other thing that I think is important, and I carry this with me, I mean, I really feel a deep sense of obligation to the people that trust in investing in my organization or the organizations I serve. So I feel like there is a moral obligation to deliver as best as we possibly can. I know this is a little hard to see, and I will be posting the slides for this on my LinkedIn page, and we'll make certain that Jody's got all of your email addresses. We'll make certain you've got my email address, or I'll make certain you get it again, and you can get the slides here. But the next two slides kind of just pay attention to what's in the circles. There are different points of evolution with an organization, and depending on how old they are, depending on the leadership. But I'm going to use Victory Gallop and kind of walk you through the evolution of Victory Gallop. It was started it's a therapeutic horseback riding program in Bath. It was started by two young women who really just had a passion for horseback riding, and they saw that there were therapeutic horseback riding programs around that served children with physical disabilities, cognitive disabilities, but not so much the behavioral challenges or emotional conditions. So that was kind of the niche that they wanted to be able to serve. They didn't come from any money whatsoever. However, they were riding instructors for the Firestone family when they had the Firestone Trace and all the property out in Bath. And so they did get some property that was donated to establish their program, and they had relationships, even as young women developed, with some individuals that had some significant resources. So they got I always say through sheer chutzpah and hard work, they got the resources from a couple of foundations that had connections to folks that were in the equine field, and they established their program. So at the beginning, it was really the two of them with a lot of passion, a few relationships, and a couple of folks that believed in them to invest. They had a board. It wasn't really, I would say, high functioning. A lot of the board members were close friends, people that they knew in the equine industry. I came on board. I got recruited by their father off the tennis court, who knew that I worked in the nonprofit sector. Excuse me. And we developed a strategic plan, and we worked on developing the board. And so the next step was we started getting a little bit more in place in terms of the operations. They knew they needed to do some fundraising to get things going. They had a couple special events. The organization kept growing. They started getting some visibility in the community. They were doing a good job, so word of mouth was traveling. They were getting more referrals for children to serve. And today, it's a high-functioning organization. You'll see more on there. I'll share more about their financial stability later. But my point is that with most organizations, like some that we heard, it starts because a couple people saw a need, had a passion, used their networks, got the resources, started to build an organization. Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold, so. And that's kind of the trend. Now, some organizations will go through this process a couple times. If I look at Countryside Conservancy right now, they're going through a rebirth. So, you know, when they lost their visionary founding executive, they also lost some resources at the time because funders are leery of investing in an organization without that visionary funder. So they pared back their staff. They got down to maybe 1.5 staff. The board has rejuvenated. There are new board members on. We're getting a committee structure in place. We're starting to do some robust and different type of fundraising. And so they're starting their process over again. Excuse me. And that's another way to look at it. When you have it in front of you and you can see the detail, it will make sense. But it's more about what takes place in terms of the capacity building internally. And the board in a nonprofit, you've got your board, which is required by law, and that's because they provide checks and balances. They're legally obligated to steward the resources of the organization, make certain the mission is optimally being fulfilled. You have staff. Some organizations have a lot of staff. Victor Gallop has stayed pretty much with their two co-directors who also function pretty much on a full-time basis teaching therapeutic horseback riding. They also pretty much on a full-time basis maintain the entire farm. Now they do have a very large, loyal volunteer corps. So that would be one distinction with Victor Gallop is they've been able to keep their costs down because a lot of the farm maintenance is done by volunteers. And they also use student interns, what have you, quite effectively. But you can see as the organization grows, you get more organizational capacity, but with that comes more management opportunities and challenges. I wanted you to just kind of see a little bit, we'll talk about in detail what foundation giving, bequests, what have you, but this was from 2016, and you can see that by and large, most nonprofits still get the bulk of their funding from individual contributions. Corporations are relatively small, and we'll talk more about that as well. I really enjoy interfacing with corporations, but more importantly, I try to encourage nonprofits to interface with them for in-kind goods and services, not just the financial support they can give, and we'll talk about a couple of clear examples of that later. Bequests is planned giving. Bequests would be if an organization or an individual leaves you in their will and you inherit money, property, what have you, from that will. This is real interesting to me because I've been in the nonprofit sector, honestly, for about 40 years, and I've seen these trends change a lot. I was really quite surprised, although when I look at the trends nationally and internationally, I shouldn't be surprised that religion is comprising as much of that pie in terms of contributions. But what I will say is about 20 years ago, education was much, much higher than religion. So you're seeing some shifts, at least over decades, in terms of the priorities. And as I said, environment used to be a little bit higher, and I think I don't know where, it can't go down a whole lot more, but clearly it's low priority on a national level is reflected there. And health used to be a little bit higher, and I'm surprised health isn't higher there. We're going to talk about each one of these nonprofit revenue sources in detail. And I don't want you to get overwhelmed, but I think the opportunity here is to see how many different sources of revenue there might be. Now, depending on where you are in your organization's development, you're going to be pursuing different types of revenue. So, for instance, when Victory Gallop first got going, most of their gifts came from individuals that made a gift or that maybe attended a special event, and then they had some foundation grants that helped them. Today, we actually have the start of an endowment fund at Akron Community Foundation, and I would say over the next 10 years, our opportunity is to build that, because our two co-directors are probably going to retire in another 10 years. And so that organization will go through a significant leadership change. So it's going to be important that as they go through that change, they've got some independent sources of funding to support them through that. I was reading the Akron Beacon Journal today, and Bob Dyer's column had an article about, he measured all the junk mail he got. I didn't read it in detail, but it was like over the last 2 months. And the second highest frequency of what he termed junk mail were direct mail requests from nonprofits. So we'll talk more about direct mail. While it still can be an effective vehicle, it's also got a lot of competition and not a particularly great reputation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the pros and cons. Government grants could be coming from the federal government, the state government, the city government, even county. Could be federal money that comes down to a state and local level that you apply for. The nice thing about it is that they're for larger sums of money. A good example, one of my relatively young and new clients is called Birthing Beautiful Communities, and it's a neighborhood-based initiative up in the Cleveland area and the University Circle area, to be specific, that provides home-based services to pregnant mothers that are at high risk of losing a baby. And they were created because there's a huge need. Like in Summit County, there's a high infant mortality rate, even higher in Cuyahoga County. So right now, all of her funding is coming from Ohio Medicaid, and then we just recently submitted a grant to the Ohio Department of Health. And we did just receive, her first grant was $1.5 million from Department of Ohio Medicaid. Now that sounds great, but you know, she was referred to me, and we are working very quickly to diversify her sources of funding, because if you followed any of the budget conversations at a state and national level, I don't know how long the funding is going to continue for Medicaid. And while I think that they are doing absolutely essential, life-saving work on a day-in and day-out basis, I don't want them to, that life-saving work to be dependent on that government funding. Doesn't mean we're going to stop going for it, because we need it and we will. But we already are working to develop other foundation support, some special events. They've taken their first foray to get a vehicle using a crowd rise or a social media fundraising campaign. So we're just beginning that journey. So the good news is you can get large sums of money, but the downside of it is it's unpredictable, as we just talked about. It's usually not sustainable. The other thing I mentioned is it can artificially inflate your organization. You don't get grants for $1.5 million without huge accountability and high expectations for delivering, and you darn well better deliver, or you'll never get a federal grant or state grant again. So we're building the capacity internally to be able to deliver that. But if we don't replace that money, then we'll go the staff will go away, the services will go down, and that's not a particularly healthy trend. It requires a ton of work. I think people see cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching when they read through federal grant applications, and they'll come to me, and they're so excited about the chance to get $5 million or whatever it might be. And I'm a realist. I tell them, I said, you're going to be up against hundreds, if not thousands, of applications. It had better be exceptionally unique and exceptionally high quality in terms of concept. And it's going to take me, by the way, at least a week of my time. And that translates into X amount of your money. And, if it doesn't get funded, That's X amount of not just my time, everybody else's time, and that money that you spent without a return on investment. So I won't even take on a federal or state grant writing project unless I think there's really a good chance of success, and I've done enough of them that I know that. And usually the shortcoming on my end is that I have a client that has not really nailed down the detail of their conceptual game plan. And I can help them get there, but I can't create their program for them. It's sometimes influenced by policymakers. And these aren't necessarily in any kind of priority order. Earned income sometimes, depending on the type of organization that you are. If you are serving a client base that has the ability to pay for services, then it makes sense to charge that. With Victor Gallop, 85% of the children that we serve come from families with very low income. So most of the costs of providing for their services are underwritten by all the different other sources of funding that we have. But we still do charge for those. They're located in Bath, and my line for years has been, and I hope nobody takes this offensively, but that surely there must be some people in Bath that can afford to pay the full fee of having a child go through and receive therapeutic horseback riding programs. And if they're paying the full fee, then they're helping to underwrite the cost of some of the others. I'm not going to go through all the details there. The third one there on cons, though, may get pushback from for-profits. I worked for a few years with a YWCA, and like YWs and YMs everywhere, we had a robust health and fitness center. And we sometimes did had experienced tension from, for-profit fitness centers that felt it was unfair competition. So I think you have to be very careful in terms of your pricing structure if you're offering services that are also being offered by for-profits. What I can say with our YWCA is that the services we were providing were at such a low fee that it afforded pretty much everybody to be able to use them. And that wouldn't have been the case for many of our for-profit competitors. Any questions on that? So anything earned income would be revenue-generating services. Generally I think of it as the fees that people pay to benefit from your service.
I just want to point out, Barb, that not all money is free money. There are situations where money you earn will be taxed at a flat 5% rate, according to the revenue code. It's unrelated business income. So while it's great to take in that dollar, you may realize roughly that you have to pay 35 cents of that dollar.
How is that figure as to why it's on your purpose. So if the purpose, I'm just thinking of you only go to where you normally taught, or just taught for kids stem cell research, stem technology to be connected out for a party.
For wedding.
Right. So that could be captured.
Yeah, I know. When I was with public television, we were always very careful of any unrelated business income taxes. And I think that's a good example that you gave. I know the Akron Urban League has what they call President's Hall, and they have a catering service. But ironically, after 10 years of not particularly doing great in that business, they're discontinuing it and rededicating the space for more direct mission-related services. Yeah, we have United Way, we have urban leagues, the YMCAs are all part of a national organization, and when you're writing foundation grants, often they'll ask if you're part of a federated organization. And if you're a United Way funded agency, you certainly appreciate and benefit from not just the funding they give, but the visibility they give. I think usually there's a perception that if the United Way is supporting your organization, it's kind of like the Good Housekeeping seal of approval. It's relationally based in many cases. Now, in Summit County, the United Way has gone through a major overhaul of its strategic funding priorities. And I know one of my former clients, Access Shelter for Women, all of the shelters in Summit County saw a decrease in their funding from United Way because their priorities have changed. So even though if you get United Way funding, it's a relatively secure and generally predictable source of funding, again, priorities change. And so the more diverse your funding, the better. Sometimes there are strings that come attached to, I might point out, and I say strings, usually I'm a big believer in accountability, and I know my staff used to complain about having to write a grant report, and I would come back and say to them, well, what do you think $40,000 is worth? I mean, I think it's perfectly appropriate for a funder to ask for a report on how the funds were spent. But you need to be prepared that a portion of somebody's time is going to need to be spent preparing those reports. For Victory Gallop, I'm a volunteer. I've written their grants for 15 years. I do everything. I write the thank you letters. I do the reports with their support. They'll get the data that I need, but we're on that, and we're proud of it. I make a distinction between major gifts and then individual gifts, and it varies depending on the organization in terms of how you define a major gift. For some organizations, a major gift might be $10,000 or more, but for our purposes, I'm going to say $5,000 or more. Most grassroots organizations, if they get a gift of $5,000, it's required a different form of cultivation to get that gift. So I make that distinction. But the individual contributions are all of the contributions that you might get that are going to form the base of your support. Again, I hope you don't get tired of listening about Victory Gallop, but we'll talk about them. If you're talking about Victory Gallop, they do a direct mailing at the end of the year, and they actually do quite well with that because they have a loyal core group of supporters that brings in about $40,000. They do 2 special events a year that each generate between $70,000 and $80,000 a year, but the special events are comprised of a lot of individual contributions, corporate contributions, what have you. And you'll see this later on, but in fundraising, we use the terminology, the funding pyramid. And at the base are all these individual contributions of whatever they might be, $2,500, $500, $1,000, and up here it could be a $1 million gift. So my point in doing this is that you can't discount all these little gifts because they really form the basis of your funding base. And if you do a good job of cultivating this base of funders, with time, you'll move your way up with some of these donors to higher levels of funding. The other things that go into that would be, individual gifts could come from telemarketing. There are a lot of different ways to get those individual gifts. The larger ones obviously are going to be more relationally based. The more somebody is involved in understanding and knowing your organization, the more likely they are to consider giving a larger gift if they have that capacity. So, there's obviously a higher return on investment for your time that goes into it, but it requires more time. And I say often unrestricted. That really kind of depends on the donor that you're working with. Do you know what I mean by restricted or unrestricted? Some donors are going to give because they want to see you get a new van to be able to deliver your home health services. So, then you would have to use those funds exactly as they were. I try to structure as many giving opportunities as I can from an unrestricted perspective to provide maximum flexibility for the organization. But it really comes, when you're going after a larger gift, it really comes down to knowing what is in the interest of your donor. The latter half of our session today, we'll be talking more about cultural philanthropy and really trying to fit the needs of the donor. And I would say, as you start to, Victory Gallop would be a good example again where, in the early days, all of our contributions were probably $1,000 or less. Today, we've got some pretty sizable individual donors. We've had one donor who gives like $50,000 a year to underwrite the expenses of one of our special event fundraisers. And so from those special events and from those smaller donations, as individuals have gotten more engaged, we've cultivated them and we've been able to get larger and larger gifts. So that's one thing I'm proud of for such a small organization. Now, I think the two people that really get the credit are the two co-directors, because they're just really hardworking, dynamic, talented individuals. And their good stewardship of their program and the incredible impact they've had on a couple generations of kids now, or at least one generation of children, is really what has generated the trust and the confidence of donors. Telemarketing. When I with public television, telemarketing was big. It was, you know, it was kind of we were on the cusp of the cutting edge, and I can remember working with a telemarketing firm. I would write the scripts. I would go in and train the telemarketers, and you know, the return on investment was substantial. Today, it has a very different story, and it's really, I think, predominantly effective with, you know, major national organizations that can put the time and the investment in getting really highly trained telemarketers to do the work. And as somebody who, you know, supported telemarketing for years, I'll be the first to say that sometimes the telemarketers drive me crazy when they call my home, particularly in the middle of dinner time. But the reality is telemarketing can still be effective, and it comes down to using professionals. You need to know that it's highly competitive and that it's harder to reach the donors than it used to be. And the other thing is there's a higher pledge default rate. So if you can, there have been some stories in our paper over in the last, I'm going to say, 5 years with, InfoCision had some high-end clients, but when the media did some investigating and saw what percentage actually went back to the organization, it wasn't a high amount. Now, the bottom line is, for that organization, it was still effective. They were still getting X amount of money and X amount of return on investment. The question was whether that was satisfactory for the donor, knowing that such a small percentage was actually going back to the organization. So if you get into telemarketing, you really need to know what you're doing today. But, you know, 30 years ago when I was doing it, was highly effective for public television. And we already talked a little bit about direct mail, I would say social media is more and more taking a percentage away from the direct mail. I personally enjoy social media more than direct mail because there can be instant engagement online with a donor. You've got the visuals that can be dynamic. There's just a lot to work with from my perspective with social media. So I'm more and more working with clients that are working to build that base of their support. You're not going to get too many gifts of 1,000 or more through social media, but if you're looking to build awareness, get some modest engagement, and get a multitude of small donations, that can be, social media can be a very effective way. Have any of you experimented with social media? Okay. Any thoughts from some of you that have?
It's definitely successful, I think, for the manual group. You don't want to be paid direct mail out of your side-to-side fundraising because it is going to reach the low demographic or people like me who don't have a Facebook account. So things like that we want to keep in mind. There are people who don't want to be involved in social media, so you want, if you are mailing to them or calling them, you're not going to push them.
Very, very good points, and I would echo that. Here's social media, and I said older adults are uncomfortable or insecure with online giving. Yes?
I just read an article where they did a study on the social medias for small environmental organizations, but one of the drawbacks is it's like they're not that invested in your organization, and it's not a great way to get volunteers or donors necessarily. That's just what they were saying they found in the study. You know, you will get some attention, and you will. There are pros, but it has the drawback of not really cultivating a longer-term relationship with people.
Yeah, I have a feeling that social media may go the way of direct mail, that there may be so much proliferation that it will diminish in return.
They were looking at small nonprofits that were specifically environmental, so I don't know. They didn't talk about whether it was just that area that this happened, and the implication was that it could be throughout.
Right.
Think about all the GoFundMe accounts that come your way. How many friends are running a marathon or doing something for somebody, now just asking you to go find somebody.
Yeah.
So people get inundated, just like they did with dark mail, and it's delete, because it's just too much to go through.
Yeah, I think you hit on something there, though. I think it's great. My experience is it can be great when there's an affinity with somebody or an organization. The Women's Endowment Fund is largely older women. Probably it's a diverse group of women, but very not comfortable with social media, and we've been kind of slowly working with them on that. But we've still got a core that still prefers to mail their check in. Some don't even like to use credit cards online. So enough said about social media, but for now I love it. Membership dues, again, that's coming from individuals, but it's for where there's a strong affinity. You know, you've got members of Stan Hewitt, or public television is a good example. I mean, probably because I worked in public television for so many years, but I still use public television as a option for viewing. I listen to NPR in the TVs in the car, so we still, pay our membership dues on a regular basis. So it's where there's a little bit of loyalty there. Yes.
Get that membership, that's my donation to the organization.
Right. So again, having good, when we talk about organizational capacity, having good data on your donors or your members is really important. I spent several years writing grants for Western Reserve Public Media. They had exceptional data on their donors, and they worked with Blackbaud, which is a major fundraising donor management software corporation, but that helped them move some of those members up in the tier. I'm kind of conscious of time, and I promised a little bit of a break, so I'm going to suggest, why don't we, are you comfortable with a 5-minute break, or do you think 5 or 10 minutes? 5 and 5 minutes, because there's still a lot to cover, and I want to make sure we get through it. So why don't you take a quick break, do what you need to do, and we'll come back. Okay, I think we've got pretty much everybody back in. Thank you for being respectful of the time. I do appreciate that. We're going to kind of continue on, and I kind of want to reiterate that while these are all the various sources of revenue that are available for cultivating and growing with an organization, again, the cultivation of them and when they happen are at different points in your organization. If you have an endowment fund, an endowment fund is where there is a large sum of money that's raised. Usually the endowment campaigns or capital campaigns that I work with are, the highest has been like 5.2 million, but that's a huge project, and you're not going to be able to mount a successful campaign like that until the organization is well established, has significant capacity, has significant relationships, significant visibility. But my point is, time marches on, and you build that foundation, and you build those solid relationships, and you work on delivering the very best services and programs that you possibly can. You will eventually grow your capacity, position the organization to get larger and more varied types of gifts. So for those that are just on the front end of starting a nonprofit, I go back to, the first time I went out to Victor Gallop, we did strategic planning in the arena, where the horses are. And it's the only time I've done a strategic plan like that, but we had to start somewhere. Since then, they've built their credibility, they've built the organization. If you were to go out to Victor Gallop, it is an absolutely stunning farm. It is maintained in tip-top condition, but again, it's taken them 20 years to get there, so I don't want you to feel overwhelmed with the array of types of funding that you get. You don't get to an endowment until you build all those individual relationships at the base. Okay, so I'm not going to say a lot about endowment other than to say that over time, and if you're working with a larger organization, to me it is one of the best ways of assuring the sustainability of the organization, because the way an endowment works is, say you start an endowment at Akron Community Foundation or wherever for $10,000. 5% of that $10,000, 5% of the interest that's earned can then be drawn out and used for whatever purposes you so designate. So, again, you're not going to see a lot of money coming in to support you from that interest until you build the principal. But, every organization that has an endowment fund has taken all those steps to get there. So most of the, I'm going to use Access Shelter for Women. That's a relatively, I mean, it's a high-profile organization because of the types of services they provide. They provide emergency shelter for women, and then they have a longer-term transitional housing facility. But their budget is less than $1 million. I know $1 million sounds like a lot for those of you that are working with a $7,000 or $8,000 budget, but it's relative. And they recognize the vagaries in the funding policies and priorities, and they came to me about 5-6 years ago asking if I would help them. I didn't feel they were ready yet, so we spent about 2-3 years working with the board to help them understand what it was going to take. In their case, we raised about $1.5 million, what it was going to take to raise that. And $1.5 million still isn't going to generate a great deal of interest, but that it's still a start, and that their intent is to continue to grow it. And with about a 2-year effort, what I can tell you is before we started that campaign, and that was we started about 3 years ago, we ended it a year ago, they had never had a gift of over $10,000. We had a donor who believed in the leadership of the organization and who offered a matching challenge grant. He said, if you can get 2 $100,000 gifts, I will give you a $100,000 gift. I honestly did not think we would be, I didn't voice this, but that was a pretty steep order. It could be, because when you look at what their funding history had been, we'd never had a gift over $10,000. And the number of individuals that have the capacity to make a $100,000 gift that we had relationships with were few and far between. But do you know that we were successful in meeting that? One of those gifts came because one of our board members invited somebody who has significant giving capacity in to see the shelter on a weekend. An hour after that visit, that woman called back and said, I want to make a $100,000 gift to help you qualify for that challenge grant. The other gift came from relationships that again, every major gift we got came after we brought people into the shelter to see the life of what it's like for the women in the shelter and to see the services being delivered. So again, that's a story where honestly, I did not think we were going to be successful, but we were. We never said no. So they're on their way to growing their endowment, and that's one good story I feel good about. You've heard a lot of talk about grants. We started out talking about government grants. There are all kinds of foundations. In Summit County alone, there are easily 40, 60 foundations. Some are big, like the Burton D. Morgan Foundation or the PEG Foundation. Some are small family foundation. Some are like just our donor-designated funds that are held at the Akron Community Foundation. But the reality is, every one of those foundations has funding priorities. They all exist to give out charitable grants. So it requires some capacity. One of the reasons I volunteer for Victor Gallop is because it's one way I can't make a major gift. Excuse me. But I can write grants. And so last year we raised about $90,000 in the grants that I wrote. So if you can find somebody who's got a passion for writing and likes, following the guidelines of the foundations, I mean, I really fell in love with writing grants because, again, I'm a communicator first and foremost, I think, and I love to tell the stories of the clients that I serve, or in this case, Victor Gallop. And so, that's one area, if you can, again, there are good writers and good communicators out there. If you can find somebody, if you can't find them on a voluntary basis, then it's probably worth it to contract with them. I think that for many of the smaller organizations, a contract between $5,000 and $10,000 a year. I'm retiring, so I'm not saying this, for my benefit. But there are good grant writers that are out there, and the return on your investment can be substantial. And it varies from organization to organization. Somebody like a Victor Gallop is really pretty easy to write for. I always say they're warm and fuzzy. You've got Petey the pony. Petey passed away a year ago, so we now have Willie the pony. But Willie goes up to the hospital and visits children. We have all just really good feel-good stories, and I use the visuals in my grants unless it's an online application. But Victor Gallop, really, I think about 80% of the grants that I write get funded. And those that don't, it may be because they're asking us to take a break. We have a very, very high success rate. But there are other organizations, and I'm going to suggest some of the religious-based organizations. I have faith-based clients. They're harder to get funded because in some cases there are restrictions for funding faith-based organizations. I always tell my faith-based organizations, be who you are, don't shy away from who you are. We'll find the organizations, the family foundations that will support a faith-based organization. But just know that if you do go into grants, and I think for many of you it's got to be a portion of your funding base, it's going to take somebody who's diligent in doing the research on the foundations, developing the relationships with the foundations, maintaining the reporting, what have you. Now for me, I probably spend about 1 to 2 hours a week on Victor Gallop. That's year-round. So that gives you an idea, and that's, that's just one organization, and that's not a huge amount of grant requests. Okay, I talked earlier about corporations, and I just recently facilitated a meeting, it was earlier this week with, it was actually Thursday, with Goodyear and the Akron Urban League. They have a relatively new executive director and a new fund development director, and I remembered that their director of community engagement had, in a presentation, had said, everybody always comes to us for funding, but we've really got great in-house resources, and we like to deploy those resources. Well, here's a good example of how these two organizations are going to come together. As part of their after-school STEM program, they are bringing in a pilot who helps young people build planes. And then they get the mentoring, the engineering, everything that goes with building a plane. But they needed a place to house their plane. So I think Goodyear is going to be housing all the parts and providing the space where we can build the plane. But it's probably going to go beyond that because I think there's a significant interest in getting some of their engineers and some of the Goodyear employees to work side by side with the young people in doing that. So our young people are in for a fabulous experience. And that, to me, is a far better way to develop a relationship with a corporation because then they see your mission up front, their employees are getting satisfaction in their role, and then you're building the space and the opportunity to later perhaps get into a financial relationship. So that's just one example. But most of the big corporations have tremendous talent and tremendous resources. Omnova Solutions, which now is up in Beechwood, but still has a plant in Mogador, does all kinds of wall coverings. If you go over to the job center, all the walls are done with contributions from Omnova Solution. So again, I just encourage you to do your research if you're going to a corporation, and don't just think about the money that might be possible because you might get far more in terms of the in-kinds there. We already talked about planned gifts and bequests. The only thing I will say with that, I've been fortunate when I was with public television, I learned that sometimes the most loyal donors, we had a donor who maybe gave $50 a year every year, and when she died, we found out that she was in her will, and we got $30,000, and that was like 40 years ago. So it requires promotion. People need to know that you need to plant the idea that they could leave a legacy in terms of including you in their will. And it's something, again, my husband and I we're very modest income people, but we only have one child, and I've spent my whole life in the nonprofit sector, and there are a couple of organizations that we've included in our bequests to benefit. It won't be huge sums of money, but it will let them know that they were important in our lives.
And Mark, there's also could be tax advantages too to the family.
Yeah, and not being a tax specialist, that's the first thing I say is there are tax advantages, and talk to your tax advisor about them. But they also know that there's a Leave a Legacy foundation that provides all kinds of professional consultation and support for organizations that really want to establish a robust planned giving program. I don't think you need to spend a lot of money doing that, but I think you need to have somebody who's knowledgeable about the ins and outs. Some of the nonprofits that I work with have advisory councils, planned giving advisory councils or teams or what have you, that can bring the expertise to the table. Certainly if you have an aging donor population, it's something to think about. I did a campaign with Hoban High School, and they've got decades of very loyal alumni, and that would be a good example. And believe me, they've got a planned giving program in place. Special events. You know, special events I love them and I don't. What I love about them is it's a great way to cultivate volunteers. It's a great way to raise visibility. It can be an effective way to raise money. It can be fun. The flip side of that is they are labor and time intensive. I find that they burn staff out. They tend to be ideas that the board has, but that the staff ends up making happen. So I'm very careful on the boards that I'm at. If somebody comes up with an idea that people seem to support, I usually try to bounce it back and say, that's a great idea, will you lead that committee? So that it doesn't move over onto the shoulders of the staff. Staff have to be involved, obviously, but just know what it's going to take. And I think it's hard to sustain a good special event. With Victor Gallop, for years we did a Kentucky Derby party. That was very appropriate because of the horse theme, and we raised funds, but we felt it was also held at at area country clubs, so we were kind of missing a big part of the community that we serve, and it just felt like it was getting old, and so we abandoned it, and then we went to a hoedown, which is held in the fall, and it's at Victor Gallop. To me, that's much better because people get to see the program in action, and they get to see the premises of the place. But just know why you're doing a special event if you do it, and know that it's going to tax a lot of people at some point. I've already talked about capital endowment campaigns, so I'm going to leave that because we've still got quite a bit here to cover. I wanted to just show you, this is Victor Gallop, and again, I have their permission to share this information. What I really wanted to show you, and I know that's kind of hard to see, but you can see the different sources of funding. And you can see that while foundation grants are still up there as a percentage of their total budget over time, and I'm going to go to the next slide. Over time, as a percentage of their budget, their grants decreased from 31% in 2003 to 24%. And there's no magic rule, I don't think, in terms of what percentage of your total budget should come from any particular source, because each organization, as you can hear in this room, the diversity of the nonprofit sector is tremendous. But I usually don't like to see much more than 25% coming in from foundation grants. Now, it doesn't mean, not like my client up in Cleveland, 100% is coming from federal and state funding right now. It's the way it is, but as soon as I can diversify that revenue base, I know they'll be in a healthier position. And it doesn't mean we're not going to go after a grant if there's a grant that we can pursue. But what it means that over time, I think we've got a healthier array and less dependency on any one particular source. So that's kind of the point of just sharing those figures. And the other thing that, if I go back, for us, special events became the big deal. But as I mentioned, within those special events, it's the major gifts that we've gotten that have made those special events go up. If I had a separate category, if I had time to go back and track, major gifts should probably be a separate category now in the pie chart. And I wanted to share Habitat for Humanity did a $2.1 million capital campaign, and I want to kind of set the stage for you. They used to be located on Rosemary Boulevard, which is down near the Blimp hangar, or one of the hangars, and it was a very small, dismal place. There was no place for anything but meeting. The board was crammed into a really tiny little room. If clients came in, there was no place for their children to play. If a truck went by, the whole building shook. It was really not an uplifting place. And so they decided that they wanted to move to, it was a Handy Andy facility over on Romig Road. And it was going to cost $2.1 million to renovate that Handy Andy facility. Well, make a long story short, but when we started that, the recession was in gear, for sure. And so the campaign was a little more challenging than we expected, but we had really great leadership. We actually negotiated with the developers that they wouldn't need to make their first payment on any of the renovations until we had the cash flow in from the campaign. So, we thought about everything we possibly could to make certain we didn't come up short, because they had a financial commitment. They had locked into an agreement to purchase this facility and renovate it. But what was particularly great is they had never had a restore. How many of you know what the restore is? Yeah, okay, so it's a place where you take your donated household goods, they refurbish it, and then they resell it. Since they made that change, their visibility of the organization dramatically moved up. They have way better space. They've got a children's room for the children when the parents come in for their financial literacy classes or whatever they might be. But the restore is providing something like 40% of their total operating budget now. So they went from, before they didn't have a restore, now they've got the restore. And you see the trucks all over as they come to pick up stuff. So that's like one of the best stories of nonprofits that I've worked with in terms of really dramatically improving their sustainability over time. This is a little hard to read, but just look at the outer circle, because I want to spend some time talking about what it takes to really build your organizational capacity to develop these different sources of revenue. And hopefully by now you're getting the understanding that it's not easy to run a nonprofit organization. It's probably, I've worked in at least one or two for-profits, and I know they have their challenges too. But if I were to simplify it, with for-profits, they sell products or services, and with nonprofits, you provide services and programs, but you do it through the generation of funds from a variety of sources. So to do that, you've got leadership capacity, and that's with your board. Susan and I were just talking about that a little bit. I mean, I'm very careful about any board that I go onto, and I have really high expectations because I don't want to just spend my time. I'm there because I'm really dedicated to the mission of the organization, and I want to see it be the best it can possibly be. And so that's always what I'm aspiring to contribute to as an individual board member or for the boards that I work with, is helping them understand why they're there, what their appropriate roles are, and what the role is, yes, in helping generate funds. It may be, I've learned if somebody is really not comfortable asking for money, I'm not going to try to talk them into taking that role, because I'll probably get what you might expect, reluctance in the whole process. But they might be very good at setting up a coffee to introduce the organization. You figure out what their talents are. Maybe they're very good at, with the Women's Endowment Fund, once a year we go and we have a night at, somebody hosts a dinner, and then we have a list of all of the donors, and we pick up the phone and we call them and we just thank them. So there are different ways that boards can be involved, but hopefully you have a few that are willing to ask for money, because at some point you do have to ask for money. And that would be the thing that I think at some point in my career, I think it was when I was at public television, because I started out in marketing, and I could see all the things that our station could be if we just had this money. If we just had this money, we'd be able to do local programming over here, we'd be able to do this, or we'd get this one fancy piece of equipment. And I just realized that somebody's got to play that role. And so I increasingly just put myself out there to learn more. I remember when I made my first ask, I really was pretty nervous about it. But when you start, again, when you do it on an authentic relationship basis, I find that exciting. I mean, I really do get charged up now about asking for money, but I'm really always about linking with the individual donor prospect, learning as much as I can about what their interests are, even what their needs are, because people have needs, and you can help fulfill those needs. And I think when I look at leadership capacities, that's all part of that. You've got the adaptive capacities. That's doing strategic planning, doing some scanning, taking a look at where there are opportunities to partner with other organizations. You've got your resource development. You've got your enabling capacities, which are going to be all your programs and services, your communication. It's that whole circle of capacities. So again, I don't want to overwhelm you, but any high-performing organization is going to have pieces and parts to it. If you're looking at resource development, you're going to need to have some way of getting information on your donors, communicating with your donors, tracking their gifts over time. So these are some of the capacities that you need to be thinking about building within your organizations. Now, again, some of it's going to be informal at the beginning, and then you'll maybe move to an Excel spreadsheet. But at some point, you'll have enough donors that you need to go beyond that and maybe get donor management software. We've got a couple financial folks in here, QuickBooks. I mean, there's good, inexpensive technology out there to help you with those pieces. This is, in the last 10 years, is probably where I've spent a good bit of my time, because I went to one workshop many years ago and I heard somebody say, fundraising is sales, just get over it. And I really found that offensive, because I do not feel that my role is ever to sell somebody about a program or a service or a mission. So it's trying to create a culture within an organization where donors feel compelled to give, not pressured to give. I mean, if somebody's compelled to give, how likely are they to come back and give a second time? Not likely. I don't think coercion is a particularly effective way to building a donor base. So, hopefully you've inspired them enough about your mission that's why they give. Again, that their interests match the organization's needs. It's funny with Victor Gallop. I grew up with horses. I really didn't like horses. My mother was a highly accomplished rider, and I was afraid of horses, to be honest. My mother died when I was fairly young, and I don't know whether it's divine providence that brought me back into the world of horses, but there was something there that connected me. And now I can tell you, even though I write the grants and I'm behind the scenes, I try to get out there 2-3 times a year just to walk with the kids. We always have 2 spotters on each side, so that I can reconnect with the mission and the impact, because I want to be able to convey that always in the work that I do for them. And if I lose that emotional passion, then I don't think I can be as effective. It's a place where people want to be. And think about it, whether it's the for-profit world or the nonprofit. Can you think of some places that just feel better when you go into them? And why is that? Again, I'm picking on Victor Gallop probably too much, but it's a place where people smile. People feel good there. You're always given a welcome. You have people of all ages. You better like animals, because there's horses, cats, dogs, you name it. But it's a vibrant place. And then this last one, I can't say it enough. Everybody plays a role in supporting philanthropy. When I write my grants, I use testimonials. So I've got volunteers that will have shared testimonials about what the volunteering means to them. I've got parents that have written that. We've actually got children that are now adults. One year, Reader's Digest did a program on Petey the Pony. And the month after, 2 of our former writers, one who was heading off to serve in Afghanistan and one who'd got married and was living in the South, both wrote letters to Reader's Digest talking about how Victor Gallop changed their life. We could never predict that was going to happen. That was like in a national, but when you have those kinds of stories and testimonials, it makes a difference, and everybody can help make that happen. So again, this is probably the most important piece, I think, of the time that we've spent this morning is, no matter where you are in your organization, maybe your organization is 25 years old, maybe maybe you're just starting out. Try to, build that place where everybody wants to be, focus on authentic relationships. You can't talk enough about your mission and its impact on people, because that's what it's all about, ultimately. And I think if you establish that kind of culture, the fundraising will come. It really will. It will come joyfully. I won't say it'll come easily, but it will happen in a very rewarding manner. And this is just kind of more of the same. That the 4th bullet is important, though. Again, I think I mentioned it, but people that serve on a nonprofit board or volunteer they've seen the mission up close, so they're more likely to give. So getting that engagement, seeing the mission happen, is so important. And this is, again, just trying to help you see, again, you've got the pyramid, but from a little bit different perspective. As the organization gets starts out, you've got the new supporters and prospects. And, you know, here's a good question. Where do you go to find out who might be supportive of you? Well, the special events are a good place to begin. I read a lot of newsletters. I read the newspaper. You know, I pick up, you know, ideas of who might be interested, particularly when I'm doing a campaign. When we're doing a campaign, obviously you start with the donor base that you have. But almost every time we go, whether it's a campaign or just an effort to raise money, right now for Countryside Conservancy, there's a very strong likelihood that our federal appropriation through the national parks will not happen. And we just had an emergency meeting, and we made the decision that we're going to assume that it won't happen, because that's kind of the kick in the pants we need to get rolling and developing the other sources of funding. This is a real story. This is happening right now. Now, maybe, you know, I'm hoping we're wrong, that we'll go out and we'll raise the $150,000 that we would have gotten, and then the $150,000 from the parks will come in. But in the meantime, we've already talked with a major donor prospect that we had cultivated an event last fall. Last fall, we invited about 15 people that we knew something about the mission of Countryside Conservancy and that had some capacity to give. And when we went back to one individual, we're meeting with him in a couple of days. And he knows that we want to engage him in helping make a matching gift opportunity that would be an incentive for others to make a gift. Believe it or not, $150,000 is a pretty ambitious goal for our organization, because we haven't done a lot of fundraising outside of grants. So we're on our way now. So we're at the base of that pyramid, but you know, we're getting some small and occasional donors, and we're starting to try to cultivate some more loyal and larger givers. We're not even close to, and for us right now, a major gift is probably $10,000 for our organization. And maybe it'll be more, but right now that's where we're at. And so all these different things that I've talked about kind of help you see where, based on where your organization is at in its evolution, what might be appropriate for you to engage in. Thoughts, questions? I've given you an awful lot.
One thing I'd like to add and point out, and this is why, unfortunately or fortunately, health organizations, having strong financial oversight, because I've seen small organizations turn the keys over and the cash box to somebody with no control. I just, again, would like to advise everybody here, because it seems that most everybody's small, have 2-3 sets of eyes on the financials, because when you turn them over to one person, sometimes people's worst nature takes over. I don't know how often you've seen it, but unfortunately.
Well, I think that there are reasons for checks and balances and reasons for transparencies. As a fundraiser and as a former CEO, I always said I wanted my organizations to be squeaky clean. And with the organizations that I work with, I like to see monthly or bi-monthly financial statements. For one thing, you know, I want to be able to, I don't want surprises as a board member. I definitely don't want surprises as a staff member. Everybody should know what the financial position is of the organization. So I think having just good, healthy financial reporting practices is important. A lot of nonprofits can't afford to do an external audit, which is where you have a certified public accountant come in and do a full review of all of your books and practices. If you're a larger organization, I definitely think I would recommend every 3 years that you have a financial audit. If you're a larger organization, every year. As somebody who does fundraising, I'm going to donors that are usually pretty astute with how they invest their money. So I want good financial information that I can share with them to verify that my organization is financially healthy. And if they're not, we can at least explain why not. Because sometimes we're doing fundraising because we're not in as strong a financial position as we'd like to be. But so yeah, I definitely back that. I don't know that, I haven't done the research. I don't know that the nonprofit sector has any more serious problems than the for-profit sector in terms of financial mismanagement. I have seen some people do some things over time that maybe were not ethical, but were not necessarily motivated for the wrong reasons. Here's a good example. I've seen CEOs loan personal money to an organization. I don't recommend that, but I know it's because they love the organization so much. So, you know, I kind of look at that, but I've been fortunate in that I've worked with good, solid, healthy organizations. Yes, thank you.
Mark, thanks for coming today. My question is, you know, when you meet a donor, and I work in a place where we have a natural affinity, right? People graduate from the university, so it's a little different maybe than some of the people here. But the importance of getting that first meeting and the struggle to get that first meeting with somebody, do you have any suggestions or tips for that first contact with somebody, whether it's getting a lunch and coffee, 15 minutes at their office, whatever that may be?
Yeah, I mean, I always do my homework. I don't ever go into a meeting with a donor prospect without having not only done research on them, but I usually do up a one-page talking point. I like to take another person with me for a couple reasons. People relate to different people in different ways. It's just easier to be able to bounce off of a couple people. If you're actually, the first meeting probably wouldn't be an ask, but if you're actually going into a meeting for an ask, it's harder to say no to two people versus one. So, I mean, there's some practical things there, but I always, again, my first preference is if you can get them to your organization to see the mission firsthand. I think that's going to be a more compelling way to do it. But on the other hand, I can think of one major donor who I always let that donor determine where we're going to meet, because it might be for him, it might be Portage Country Club. You know, if that's where he's most comfortable, then that's where I want to meet him. So those would be the things that I say, you know, I try to learn as much as I can about the donor. I also, you know, I try to listen. I don't try to do all the talking. Again, it goes back to trying to listen to the needs and the wants and the desires of the donor. There's just, you know, that's just, I think listening 101 is really important.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could comment on the mission, like you talked about using the mission, talking about the mission, and since I'm in a startup organization, I just worry that it might be a little too broad. I mean, I'm working on only one part of what's stated in my mission because of funding. That's what's happening right now. But my interests are a little bit broader. So is it normal for an organization through this early phase to kind of reevaluate their mission?
Well,
just comment on your experience with that?
I think it is. I think you get clearer and clearer about your mission, or the parameters of your mission as you go along. I've spent endless amounts of time helping organizations, you know, get the kind of language they want for their mission. I always say I worry less about being able to state the actual mission in the perfect language and more being able to speak from your heart about what the mission is. Again, I think connecting in whatever language it takes, but I think as long as you've got a pretty clear sense of what your mission might be. There might be fuzzy parts of that. You know, sometimes geographical coverage area is a challenge. With the Women's Endowment Fund, I think Summit County is predominantly our geographical coverage area, but I think we say Summit County and surrounding area. So as long as you, in your heart, can tell what your mission is, that's what's important. Yes?
Sort of piggybacking off of that question, though, so I guess if you look at for-profit businesses, general models are to have what's the next product or service that we're going to offer. We've made this one, people like it, so what's the follow-up going to be? I know a little bit of research that I've done so far, it seems like, you know, nonprofits, you have to have clear goals, clear mission, which makes perfect sense. But have you found that nonprofits are more successful when they maybe adopt additions to the mission down the line, or have other offerings or services that they give, or are they better off with like sticking with that one mission and just doing that as long as they can?
I think there's no right answer to that. I think Victory Gallop will just be probably stick to what it does well, and it won't change. Our biggest challenge has been thinking about succession planning when the two co-directors retire, and we're working on that. I can also think of like Project Learn 3 years ago. We did a really robust strategic plan, and they have evolved from being strictly GED literacy to now workforce development and literacy with a heavy focus on immigrant and refugee populations. And that came out of their strategic planning process. So they've kind of reinvented their mission. It's certainly broader than it was, and I think it's the right place for them to be. So I think it depends on the marketplace, the environment. Resources, to some extent, define how broadly you can be with your mission. I mean, that's just a reality. If there's anything, with Project Learn, they also just recently had a leadership transition, very good one, for all the right reasons. But, they've largely been dependent on state funding from a literacy perspective. They've got to now cultivate, they've got to, really develop the services that will capture the essence of that revised mission, and they've got to develop the resources to support it. So, here's a good example. When we started that strategic planning process, it was before United Way and GAR Foundation and some of the other ones had changed their funding priorities, and workforce development was front and center. Now, I think workforce development is still a priority, but things have shifted, and the pre-K to 16 focus, I think, is a good one for Summit County, coming from Summit Education Initiative. But a lot of organizations are having to kind of reshift to kind of fit into that funding frame. So, that's a decision for the board and the staff to make together. So, any other questions? Well, let me just make sure you have my email address. And I will get anybody a copy of the slides. I am going to put it on my LinkedIn, so you should be able to just download them from there. But my email address is BANNGREENE. I think it's on the agenda, isn't it? Okay, it's on the agenda. So feel free to email me with any kind of questions you might have afterwards. And I'll get the slides up tonight. And I thank you very much for your interest, and more importantly, thank you for all the good work you're doing in the nonprofit sector and on behalf of our community.